just now I work in Dundee College of Art, teaching fine art. I trained there as well many years ago, finished in 1979, and I've taught in art school for nearly 20 years. Work there 2 days a week, and the rest of the time I'm here in my studio making work.
Up until recently, I was a neuroscientist. So my whole life has just been doing neuroscience, understanding how cells in the brain work. And that's what I was doing when I met Jim, first of all, several years ago. And then I left that almost a year ago. And now I'm studying art in Edinburgh.
I think it's either 2004 or 2005, met in Pattison. Brian and Leslie, Brian's wife, would sit and mind their own business. Myself and John Taylor, who works in the studio, went in for a pint on a Saturday. Started talking, and I remember vividly Brian using his hands to describe this hugely complex area of science, which I thought was amazing.
When I get a bit to drink, I get very sort of handy, because I'm trying to find the word for something and trying to find a way of explaining something. And Jim was asking me about my work. So partly because of the drink and partly just because of my nature, I start doing things with my hands because there's no paper to sketch on. I probably couldn't sketch it anyway. And I'm trying to explain things in 3 dimensions. So immediately when you're talking about channels, I was trying to make little funnels and pores that open and close.
I think at that point I just arranged maybe that I could go up and see what Brian did in his lab, and Brian could come and see what I did in the studio. So we just did that a few times and had a lot of discussions. We went to a Wellcome Trust science engagement workshop in Edinburgh, and found out the ins and outs of applying for a Wellcome Trust People Award. When I started the project, I was daunted by the knowing where to start with the whole thing. It seemed such a big subject area, and coming from a point of probably knowing nothing to a point where I could maybe make some contribution about something, it took me quite a long time, a lot of reading, a lot of discussions, a lot of studio visits, a lot of lab visits. On a formal level, it's dealing with scientific information and trying to make images from it. The work that I made first tried to deal with the language, just like from the word point of view. I Google searched voltage-gated potassium ion channels and just looked at the difficulty or the kind of maybe the problems with just defining, for me, what voltage-gated potassium channels were, and how each word has its own nuance and kind of connotation that's for me had looked at first. The way I see it is that on the neuron there are channels, or maybe like pores, that let certain chemicals through, and the ones that Brian looks at are the ones that let potassium through. But as far as I know, they're beyond our scope of vision as yet.
I think the sort of breadth of the project, though, is kind of vast, because you're dealing with things which are proteins, which, as Jim says, are just at our resolution. You need to use special microscopes that use X-rays to be able to see these proteins, and even then there's questions because you're getting a kind of fuzzy structure. So we've got a rough idea of what they look like, but that's only come about in the last several years, and it's resulted in a Nobel Prize because it was a kind of holy grail. So we've got pictures of these things which come from incredibly powerful techniques, but then the next level up is the cell, a nerve cell, and that's got millions of these things on it. And then the level up from that is a circuit in the brain where you've got tens of thousands or maybe millions of cells making connections there. So you're going from the truly microscopic right up to the macroscopic understanding bits of the brain.
I didn't want to just purely make things that were illustrations of the information I was dealing with. I had to kind of try and work somewhere between.
One of the things that Jim and I have often talked about is that science is often hampered in its communication. So, one example would be that I've been using the same sort of cartoons and metaphors in words for the last dozen years, and Jim's come up with different strategies for explaining these in visual or sculptural terms, and it gives me a whole kind of new language. So I've already used some of Jim's images in lectures and teaching talks and so on, and frankly, Jim's images are so much better than the ones I was using before, or the ones in the textbook too.
Practically, I've made some of them as paintings, some of them as prints, some of them as sculptures, and the sculptures, some of the small-scale sculptures I've scanned in 3D, which I've then made into digital prints. And I'm interested in the way that the information changes, or your interpretation might change as the image or the form moves through different processes. A lot of the prints, well, in this series there are two types of prints. There are screen prints and digital prints. But I try always to try use the media that's most appropriate for the problem. Some of the stuff that I've been dealing with digitally. So I don't see much point in, some of these very complex prints, like the scan images and the squares that deal with the amino acid code. They could have been translated into screen print, for example, or maybe lithography. But I quite like the cleanness and the kind of logic of just moving it through a digital process into another digital form. I don't see, in that case, the reason for taking it into anything else. In the case of the screen prints, with these ones, I was trying to make something that was a wee bit more tangible or maybe visceral, so that they have a subtly different flavour or feel to them. They have more the notion of layers of ink on a piece of paper, much more so than the digital prints. So they have much more of a kind of sculptural quality in real terms as printed objects. I'd like to think that it could work in different levels. I'd like to think that some of the pieces of work would operate without the scientific reference. I think there are a few pieces of work that you probably wouldn't have to know the science behind it to get or appreciate the work.
As Jim says, you can see pieces that stand alone, which are really interesting, fascinating pieces of art. But there's a story there, there's a linkage, so you could go in and see maybe one print and say, oh, well, I like that. But if you look either side, then that refers to other things. So I would think that someone that comes seeing Jim's show could just walk in and look at a couple of pictures or sculptures or something and get something out of it. But they'd get so much more if they got the whole scale of what's going on. So you could start at, say, a nerve cell and go down to what the ion channels do. Or you could start at the nerve cell and then work up to the brain. And then there's disease elements as well. So you could pick up a little bit of the story, or you can pick up the whole kind of chapter.
Generally speaking, it's been a great project, and I've been fortunate working with somebody like Brian, who's got a huge enthusiasm, knowledge for his own subject area. What I've enjoyed about the project, it seems to have happened naturally. It's not like a kind of an imposed piece of research. It seems to have just kind of flowed and found its own way as it's progressed.